On 31st May 1940, on the concrete mole at Dunkirk, Major General Harold Alexander was in charge of a beaten army that any normal commander would be getting ready to surrender. His troops were cut off. The French beside him were falling back. German guns were already reaching the beaches. Every fresh report on his table said the same thing. If he misjudged this, most of the British Expeditionary Force would end up in German prison camps, and Britain might not have a real field army left to fight with. Units were asking if the fighting could stop. Alexander kept sending back tasks instead of terms, telling formations to hold for set hours, to keep key bridges open until relief arrived, and to pull out only when another unit was in place behind them. He was buying time for the men on the sand and for the ships under air attack, not looking for a deal. And he knew he was not the only one making that choice. Down on the southern edge of the pocket, Bernard Montgomery had 3rd Division stretched along a thin line that could not afford to move. His job was simple and brutal. Keep the last roads open so men could still reach Dunkirk. If that line cracked, the way to the beaches would shut, and the soldiers queuing there would go into captivity instead of going home. His division was exhausted. They had been marching and fighting for days. Some companies were down to a fraction of their strength, and the French beside them were already pulling back. Montgomery still held his line and only allowed controlled withdrawals to fresh positions under orders from his headquarters. So, when people talk about a miracle at Dunkirk, this is the piece they miss. British generals who, by normal military logic, should have been planning how to surrender an army instead, refused to treat surrender as a real option. To see how they could even think like that, we need to wind back a few months and look at the army they were actually commanding and the defeat it had just taken. When the British Expeditionary Force landed in France in the autumn of 1939, it was meant to be the steady, professional anchor of the Allied line. General Lord Gort had the overall command. His corps commanders included men like Alan Brooke and, later on, Bernard Montgomery. Many of them had fought on the Western Front in the last war. They thought they understood this kind of fighting. They trusted careful method, close coordination with the French, and the idea that a long war would favor Allied factories. On paper, their position at the start of 1940 looked solid. Several infantry divisions dug in along the Dial line in Belgium, French armies covering the Ardennes and the Meuse, reserves behind, British factories producing more equipment every month, the Navy guarding home waters. A steady, grinding war of attrition seemed to be the worst realistic outcome. The German attack in May stripped that assumption bare in a matter of days. German armoured divisions punched through the Ardennes, where Allied planners had assumed the terrain was too difficult for large-scale mechanized movement. Heinz Guderian and others forced a crossing of the Meuse near Sedan. Panzer columns broke out and drove west toward the Channel. What was supposed to be a wall of Allied strength turned into two disconnected halves in less than 2 weeks. The main French forces were to the south. The British Expeditionary Force, with parts of the French First Army and the Belgian Army, were to the north, suddenly cut off. Gort began receiving reports that felt unreal. French units on his flank pushed back far faster than expected. Bridges in his rear seized by German vanguards. Luftwaffe raids on road junctions that were supposed to be safely behind the front. If you followed French high command orders to the letter, the British were still meant to attack south and reconnect. If you looked at the actual ground situation, that attack would have driven straight into the teeth of fast-moving German armor. Gort chose to disobey the spirit of those orders and save his army. That choice matters as much as anything that happened later at Dunkirk. A more rigid commander might have clung to the coalition plan and watched his force be cut to pieces. Gort, who had been selected partly because he was considered loyal and dependable, suddenly behaved like a man willing to accept personal responsibility for breaking with higher authority. He looked at his staff maps, listened to men like Brooke on the spot, and started pulling his corps back toward the Channel ports. You also have to look at the political atmosphere in London to see why surrender was not the default question. In May 1940, Winston Churchill had just become Prime Minister. He replaced Neville Chamberlain after the Norway campaign had exposed severe weaknesses. There were powerful figures in the government who thought that, with France collapsing, Britain should explore terms through Italy and accept a place in a German-dominated continent. Churchill talked to them politely. Then he set that path aside. He told his military chiefs and his war cabinet that no approach for armistice would go out from Britain. The price in lost prestige, in imperial control, and in future security would be catastrophic. He did not think that Britain could win on land in 1940. He did believe that Britain could hang on long enough for the balance of industrial power to turn. That belief fed into the orders that went to men like Alexander and Montgomery. There would be no negotiated surrender to back up on. Alexander himself came from a family with long service and a reputation for keeping his nerve. He had fought in France and Italy in the previous war and had seen armies break under pressure. Montgomery had been a battalion commander in the First World War, wounded at Ypres, and had spent the interwar years as a training reformer with a reputation for blunt, sometimes abrasive clarity. These were not romantic figures. They were not suicidal. They were professional officers whose first instinct was to preserve combat power. That is the invisible system under the surface at Dunkirk. It was not simply patriotic rhetoric. It was a habit of mind. Ground can be lost. Ships can be built again. A trained army, once surrendered, is gone for the duration. Once you see that mindset, you start to notice it showing up again and again, even while the map keeps getting worse. The retreat to Dunkirk was not one clean move. It was a series of sharp, messy steps under constant pressure. British formations would dig in along a canal or a ridge, hold for as long as the timetable required, then pull out at night by march column, dodging German infiltrations and air attacks. Each small success in those moves contradicted the neat German picture of a panic-stricken enemy. On the German side, there was misjudgment too. Senior commanders and Adolf Hitler himself issued the famous halt order in late May. Panzer divisions, which had reached positions from which they could plausibly cut straight to Dunkirk, were told to stop. Some of that caution came from fears about ground conditions near the coast. Some of it came from overconfidence in the Luftwaffe. German leaders believed that their bombers could smash any attempt to evacuate an army across a narrow strip of sea. On paper, that halt order looked like a sensible precaution. In practice, it was a gift. It gave Alexander and Montgomery the breathing space they needed to draw a tighter perimeter and turn a routed withdrawal into an organized defense. It looked like careful control from the German high command. It was actually the moment when the initiative at Dunkirk quietly shifted back to the defenders. The same pattern appears when you look at the French pocket at Lille. General Jean-Baptiste Molinier found himself with a mixed force of French troops, surrounded by larger German formations near Lille as the rest of the Allied forces fell back toward the coast. There was no escape route on offer for him, no promise of ships. Molinier held out from 28 to 31 May, street by street fighting, ammunition dwindling, food running low. He finally surrendered when his men were physically spent and out of supplies. Those 4 days tied down several German divisions that could not then be thrown against the Dunkirk perimeter. On paper, Lille fell. In practical terms, that stubborn pocket gave Alexander exactly what he needed. More time. What you are seeing in these different pockets is not random heroism. It is a repeated choice to trade ground and men for delay, rather than trading everything for an early surrender and a neat end to the campaign. You see the same logic in the air. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, in charge of Fighter Command, was asked to provide more and more cover over Dunkirk as the evacuation intensified. From the ground, soldiers often could not see Royal Air Force fighters because those battles were happening inland or above cloud. Complaints filtered back that the skies were empty. Dowding knew that if he committed everything to Dunkirk, he could probably cut German bombing raids significantly for a week. He also knew that his fighter squadrons were the last line if the Luftwaffe turned its full weight against Britain itself. So he compromised. He sent enough to hurt the Germans and protect the evacuation, but he refused to empty the home defense. To many, that looked like stinginess. In reality, it was another version of Alexander's calculation on the mole. Spend what you must, but keep a core force intact for the next phase. German air crews later reported bitterly on the resistance they met over northern France in those days. They had expected to slaughter an army on the beach. Instead, they ran into a defense that refused to collapse. All of this escalation, all of these small clashes of philosophy, converged on one short stretch of coast. Now come back to that mole and watch the operation unfold as a single concentrated event. By the night of 31st May, the Dunkirk perimeter had shrunk to a rough semicircle behind the town and the beaches. The ground was flat and exposed, broken by canals, dikes, and scattered villages. German artillery could reach the port. German infantry were pressing in along the roads. The Luftwaffe attacked when weather allowed, dropping bombs on jetties, ships, and columns of men. Alexander's headquarters on the mole was a jumble of field telephones, signal flags, and runners. At any moment, a hit from a bomb or a shell could have wiped it out. Yet the system did not dissolve. Army staff officers and Royal Navy liaison officers shared tables. They argued over timings and capacities. A destroyer could lift roughly 700 men. A cross-channel steamer a little less. Each ship that came in had to be turned around as fast as human bodies could be marched up the narrow walkway. On the beaches, Captain William Tennant, the senior naval officer at Dunkirk, and his teams worked with brutal simplicity. Units were brought down to the sand by battalion or brigade when possible. Lines were formed. Men were told which route to take, which boat, which ship. When air raids sent men diving into the sand, sergeants and officers dragged them back into line afterward. Discipline and paperwork, the unglamorous side of an army, turned out to be the only way to move hundreds of thousands of men through a tiny port under fire. Further back along the line, Montgomery's 3rd Division and other British and French units were still holding villages and canal lines under attack. Imagine for a moment one of those positions. A small brick village, a canal bridge, a company dug in around the edges. They can hear the rumble of artillery from Dunkirk behind them and the clatter of German machine guns in front. Their officers know that at some point in the night, they will receive an order to pull back in stages. The timing of that order is not about their own safety. It is about how many more men can be got off the beaches before the cord tightens. When German patrols probe forward and find those positions still occupied, it shakes their expectation. The Allied retreat was supposed to become a stampede. Instead, they keep running into rearguards who fight, then vanish on a schedule that feels almost mechanical. German diaries and post-war reports capture that frustration. The enemy, they said, refused to break in the way earlier campaigns had taught them to expect. Out at sea, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay ran Operation Dynamo from tunnels under Dover Castle. Signals from Alexander and Tennant came in, weather forecasts, reports of minefields, lists of ships damaged or sunk. Ramsay and his staff adjusted sailing plans constantly. Destroyers like HMS Malcolm and HMS Sabre made repeated crossings. Civilian vessels, from Thames ferries to private yachts, joined the flow. Some were lost to mines or bombs. Crews pulled survivors out of cold water and turned back to the beaches again. Even the German halt order, which had given the British time to consolidate the pocket, eventually expired. Panzer units pushed forward again. German artillery fire on Dunkirk intensified. Fires spread through the town. By any rational accounting, this should have been the point where Alexander sent a message up the chain that it was over. Instead, he prepared to be the last man out. On the night of 2nd to 3rd June, the final organized British formations were taken off from the mole and the beaches. Alexander walked the perimeter, checking that positions were either filled by French troops or blown. At dawn, he signaled that the last British rearguards had embarked. He then boarded a destroyer himself. When he reached England, he sent a plain report that the mission he had been given, the evacuation of as many British soldiers as possible, was complete. In total, about 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk. Roughly 198,000 of them were British. The rest were French and a small number of Belgian and other Allied troops. The price was heavy. Almost all of the British Expeditionary Force's heavy equipment was lost. Thousands of men were killed or captured in the fighting or on sunk ships. But the core of the professional army, the trained human capital, was back on British soil. That was not an accident. It was the result of a chain of choices, from Gaut's decision to pull back, to Molinier's stubborn stand at Lille, to Dowding's careful rationing of his fighters, to Ramsay's relentless control of the shipping, to Tennant's organization on the beaches, and above all, to men like Alexander and Montgomery refusing even to consider handing their forces over intact to the enemy. Once the last ships left Dunkirk, the question facing British generals changed. They no longer had an army trapped in France. They had a battered army on home soil with most of its guns and vehicles gone. The issue now was whether that army was going to be treated as a bargaining chip in peace talks or as the nucleus of a long war. Churchill answered that publicly in early June. In his speech to Parliament after Dunkirk, he called the evacuation a deliverance. but warned that wars are not won by evacuations. Then, he laid out what the generals had already understood. Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields and streets, and would never surrender. For the men responsible for the army, that was a strategic order, not a piece of rhetoric. General Sir Edmund Ironside, and later Alan Brooke when he took over as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, had to build a real defense for a country that was short on modern weapons. They put into place the system of inland stop lines, fortified with concrete pillboxes and anti-tank obstacles. They raised the Home Guard, armed it as quickly as industry and supply would allow, and made sure that if German forces did land, they would find not a passive population, but a web of resistance and delay. Dowding continued to husband his fighter squadrons, leading into the Battle of Britain that summer. The same calculation applied: spend enough to win each day, but not so much that you ran out of fighters in a single week. When German planners shifted from attacking airfields to bombing cities in the autumn, British fighter strength had been preserved just enough to ride out the worst. This is where enemy eyes become very revealing. Captured German pilots and post-war interrogations show a clear pattern. Many of them believed that Dunkirk was a British defeat that would break morale. Instead, they found an enemy that dug in, hardened its defenses, and then, within a year, was able to launch offensives in North Africa and to send convoys across the Atlantic under increasingly effective protection. German officers who had expected a quick British collapse after France started to talk about the British as the opponent who refused to admit a lost cause. Alexander and Montgomery carried that habit of mind with them into the rest of the war. Alexander later commanded in North Africa and Italy. He had to manage retreats, advances, and coalition politics with American and Commonwealth forces. The lesson of Dunkirk was always in the background. Do not let an army be trapped without a plan. Accept that you may have to abandon ground, but do it on your own terms. He oversaw the final phase of the Tunisian campaign, and then the long, grinding fight up the Italian peninsula, where withdrawal and attack alternated under brutal conditions. Montgomery took over 8th Army in Egypt in 1942. He found a force that had taken heavy blows from Rommel and was close to the end of its patience. He told his men there would be one decisive battle, that he would not start it until he was ready, and that there would be no further retreats. At El Alamein, he used the same cold arithmetic he had used at Dunkirk, but this time in attack. Firepower, reserves, and logistics were arranged to make sure that once the battle began, the force would not have to fall back again. Look at the long line that runs from that mole at Dunkirk to the tented headquarters in Egypt and the field. Headquarters in Normandy. It is not a straight climb from defeat to victory. It is a series of crises where British generals were tempted to cut their losses in ways that would have ended their ability to fight as a first-class power. At Dunkirk, they refused to surrender an army on the beach. During the Battle of Britain, they refused to spend all their fighters in a single week. In North Africa and Burma, they refused to let reverses turn into total collapse. Each time, they kept just enough capability intact for the next round. The statistics tell you one story. The British Army lost tens of thousands of men killed and captured in France in 1940. It lost almost all of its heavy gear there. It suffered further losses in Greece, Crete, and Malaya. The empire was strained and in many ways permanently weakened. The system story tells you another. Britain kept just enough trained soldiers, skilled commanders, industrial base, and political will to remain in the fight until the tide of mass American and Soviet production turned against Germany. By the spring of 1945, Harold Alexander was a field marshal, commanding Allied forces in Italy. Bernard Montgomery was a field marshal commanding 21st Army Group in northwest Europe. On Lüneburg Heath in early May, Montgomery sat at a plain table and accepted the surrender of German forces in the north. There were cameras. There were staff officers. There were German generals signing away their armies. 5 years earlier, those roles might easily have been reversed, if Gort had held to his original orders, if the Holt Order had not given the British a sliver of time, if men like Molinier had decided that 4 days of hopeless resistance were not worth it. If Alexander had chosen the path of formal surrender on that mole, if Montgomery had pulled his flank back in panic and let the route to Dunkirk close early. Most people still talk about Dunkirk as a miracle of small boats and weather. That makes for a good poster. It hides the harder lesson. The British did not stay in the war because fishing boats appeared out of nowhere. They stayed in the war because, at a moment when professional logic said surrender was the clean option, their generals chose to preserve an army instead. They lost the campaign. They lost the equipment. They refused to lose the ability to fight on. They did not survive 1940 because of one miracle on a beach. They survived because a whole chain of officers, from the mole at Dunkirk to the War Cabinet in London, decided that surrender was the one decision they were not allowed to make.